Hi there, I'm Gugulethu Mfuphi, the host of Kaya Biz here on Kaya 959. We broadcast live on air every Monday to Thursday between 6 and 8 o'clock. Now, if you're familiar with the show, you would know that as a business show, we tend to follow through with the themes of the economic calendar. And quite recently, we heard from Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana, who addressed the South African public and various stakeholders in his maiden address, given the medium-term budget policy statement for 2021. Now, you might be asking, what does the MTBPS do, stand for, and mean? Well, essentially, it's commonly referred to as the mini-budget. This is essentially just to give us an update of what the February budget has translated into after months of implementation, but also gives us an understanding of expectations and planning that National Treasury might be considering within the medium term, essentially the next 2 to 3 years, given future forecasts. Now, for this year's MTBPS 2021, there were a few highlights that stand out for us as members of the South African public, given that we do contribute to the national purse through our taxes and contributions that we make. I guess first things first to start off with is that many might say that the minister's speech was in line with expectations. No surprise announcements, no shock rulings that were made, or even strong or harsh recommendations and suggestions. If anything, the finance minister has been very clear about the fact that we'll stick to fiscal consolidation. And essentially what that means is that we'll monitor the kind of expenses that we have and try to reduce them as quickly as possible. Now, why does this matter? Well, South Africa has essentially been an economy under strain. If you had to consider our purse as that of a household or even an individual, we actually spend a lot more on debt and paying off our debt than we do on the income that we earn. Let's start off firstly with the income. Tax revenue. Fortunately for South Africa, between the year 2020 and 2021, we actually saw a significant increase in the tax revenue collected. It ticked up by at least 120 million rand. How so? Well, if you consider that a lot of corporate companies, specifically mining companies, reported skyrocketing profits, that's because of a better performance of commodity prices. The higher profits that were earned by these mining companies meant that they had to pay out higher taxes to the government. That in itself contributed to a significant boost in income that was received by the Revenue Service. We have been cautioned, though, that whilst this is great, it does essentially mean that we need to be a little bit more careful because the boost in tax revenue is not something that might be sustainable in the short to medium term. And what the finance minister has alluded to rather, is the fact that the additional income we got from this tax revenue will be allocated to paying off our debt a lot more quickly. Speaking of debt, our debt to GDP ratio sits at about 77% for the year 2020 to 2021, and there's expectations that we could reach about levels of 85% by the year 2022-2023. Essentially what that means is that of the economic growth that we're stimulating in South Africa and creating, a large chunk of that essentially goes back to paying off debt. And unfortunately, given the ravaging impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and subsequent lockdown, South Africa had to take on a lot more debt and spend its way out of the troublesome conditions we found ourselves in. And that spent, if you think of the social grants, of the social relief packages as well that were offered to many South Africans in their households, but also to businesses and several organizations just to try to keep the economy afloat. That essentially speaks to the additional spending that we had to take on board on top of the procurement of vaccines as well as additional healthcare services that were required in order to meet the demands of our healthcare sector in light of the COVID-19 infections. So we are managing to try to cut off our debt significantly, paying it off a lot more quickly, and there have been ongoing concerns about state-owned entities. Fortunately for the moment, no new announcements and capital injections have been announced, but what the minister has highlighted is that the likes of Eskom certainly need a lot more support to make sure that they are able to keep the lights on. Only through sustainable energy resources and ongoing electricity supply will we be able to keep this economic recovery going as stipulated. One sore point that we need to be worried about as the South African public is our over-reliance on social grants. This is because at least 27 million people in the South African population, about 46% at best, essentially rely on the government for social grants. That's a huge number, especially in light of the fact that we continue to see unemployment levels rise in South Africa. Now, whilst National Treasury essentially just manages the budget and works together with other departments to try to source solutions to making sure that we see increased jobs, increase the taxpayer base, one thing is quite true that we need to be mindful of as we look ahead to the February budget for 2022. We definitely need to anticipate that the government might continue to have to make financial or capital commitments to state-owned entities. The likes of Sasria have already received a boost of 11 billion rand. That's to help keep them afloat after having to pay for the insurance cover of those who were impacted by the looting seen in June and July this year in South Africa. But as we head to 2022, we definitely need to make sure that there's some kind of clarity regarding social grants, how best we are able to stimulate economic growth in the country and attract foreign direct investment, what we do with our state-owned entities. Will there be additional capital and funding located to them? And secondly, how do we ensure that we increase and improve on the tax revenue services and themes that we've been collecting? It's a tough task ahead for the Finance Minister and the organizations that are affiliated with National Treasury. But one thing's for sure, that our contribution as South African taxpayers is at least finding its way to the right budget items in the short to medium term.